Hello, everyone. So we're going to get started. Sego, my name is Brittany Jock. I'm from Mohawk from Activism. I just finished my PhD in the Social and Behavioral Interventions program here at the School of Public Health. Thanks. And I'm very honored to give the introduction of Dr. Gabrielle Tayac. She will be doing the recognition of Indigenous peoples and territory to kick off our event, and we're very grateful to have her. She is the Director of Legacy Collections at the Spirit of Aligned Leadership program, and she earned her doctorate and master's in sociology from Harvard University and her bachelor's in social work and American Indian Studies from Cornell University. Her research focuses on American Indian identity, multiracialism, Indigenous religions, social movements, and maintaining a focus on the Chesapeake Bay region. She has served in staff and advisory capacities for many organizations, which I'll name just a few: Amnesty International, National Geographic, the Maryland Commission on American Indian Affairs, the National Park Service, and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Center for the Humanities. She also, in her youth, co-founded the League of Indigenous Sovereign Nations, which is a hemispheric alliance of Native peoples, and was a scholar at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. So I'd like you all to join me in welcoming Dr. Tayac.
I'd like to give you all my greetings and Thanksgivings. You know, it's always a little odd to hear the list of all your stuff, and to think about the list of what we've done, and then linking it to who we are, and who are we all really, and where are we from, and where are we rooted to, and how do we uplift each other. So I'm very pleased and proud. Thank you so much, Dr. Jock, to be here and for you to be on the other side of the scholarship and to start to craft and understand what knowledge is from our perspectives and our point of view. So I'm here to also bring a greeting from the land, from the rivers, from the ancestral threads, because those of us that we are in these academic institutions, we are in agencies, we are in spaces that are full of concrete and steel and roads and signs and digital waves that come through our bodies, and yet we breathe and we exist and we breathe each other in and out, and we're together. So I came here today, which is now this afternoon. I was going to say this morning, but it's not anymore technically, for us to think about and to energize each other at this time that we think about Indigenous people, although for many of us every day is Indigenous Peoples Day, and every month is Indigenous Peoples Month, and every space is Indigenous space. Wherever you go, from the Arctic Circle down to Tierra del Fuego, you are on Native space and you are in Native land. And to be here with our colleague, our artist, a visionary person of presentation of the visual, Gregg Deal, I'm so glad to be here with you this morning, and I thank you for coming and also for re-indigenizing and having us remember where we are by putting these visuals in places that you least expected. But as a scholar named Phil Deloria spoke about, Indians are always in unexpected places, and we look in unexpected ways, and you might be walking right near us and we don't look the way that you think that we do. So I am Piscataway, and Piscataway, our traditional area, is from where the fall line, what they call the fall line, is. That's right around Great Falls, all the way down the Potomac River to the mouth where it spills out into the bay. And the Haudenosaunee people called us Ganawe, which means below the falls. And so we have different names depending on where we come from. But in our sense, our name translates to where the waters blend. a confluence of rivers, a confluence of waters, a confluence of spirits and ideas, and that is very much what this region still is, that we are all connected in this sense, and that the rivers with their slight saltiness, they are the veins of Mother Earth that run through us as well. So I'm not a spiritual leader, I'm not a medicine person. What I've been taught, and as many of you might have felt this as well, that sometimes, especially in our families and in the communities that are quite small, and Gregg, you were talking about this a little bit this morning. We had a brunch this morning. Sorry, y'all didn't. You were there. There was a little group of us that met. It was really lovely. But talking about how, as Native people, especially because there's not that many of us, especially in places like this, that we get called into different aspects and different facets. So we have to pay attention, and we have to learn, and we have to fill those spaces, and it makes us smarter. So I appreciate, Gregg, for you bringing that idea up this morning. It really made me think. So from wherever you are and wherever you've come from, and maybe it's across the waves, maybe it's just down the road, we do find ourselves here. And we find ourselves in a space that is an auditorium in an illustrious institution. And we also have to understand that this is also an ancient space, and it's a modern space. It's a contemporary space. And it's one that, as the Patapsco River flows out into the bay from its littlest headwaters, where it's pure and simple and clean, and then goes through the course of history as it winds through the places where many of our Native peoples had been for tens of thousands of years, or maybe it was from the time when a woman fell from the sky, or maybe it was from a time when there was fur on the back of a deer that sprung into the life of people. Whatever it is, here we are. And we've come through that course of time and that thread of time to be together, and a lot has happened. A lot has happened to us. A lot has happened to each of us. When we're in the city of Baltimore, a place that's named for Cecil Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, that came from England and was able to de facto take over all of our territories before he even saw us, by decree of King Charles II in 1632, which deeded all of our lands to somebody we never knew and never saw, had never heard of, who had never spoken to us, and came on the Ark and the Dove, not him, but others, came on the Ark and the Dove to establish this place that was then called Maryland, with the mandate that went back centuries actually in time to the Papal Bull Inter Cetera, which was from 1493, the moment that through international law, all of the lands of what came to be known as the Americas, which we call Turtle Island, came under the discretion of Spain and then Portugal. So a lot has happened in these hundreds of years, and yet we are still here. And what does that mean? And that we're here together. So when you walk in these spaces and places, some of you are from other Native areas, some of you are from here. I want to also acknowledge the trails and the treks that so many Native people from the South, from the Carolinas, have come up and also come here to be home with us and have intermarried with our people as well and have been present from many, many different tribes. So as we stand together today, I'm carrying this feather with me today. And this is an eagle feather. It's not from the West. It comes right from a place that is our burial grounds in Occoquan, Maryland, which is directly face-to-face with Mount Vernon, which is where George Washington's residence is. And for how long eagles were decimated from those places. How long they were silenced and how we were silenced. And yet they're coming back and they're nesting and they're leaving their feathers with us for us to find, for us to connect with the spirit, for us to understand that like we're in the tidewater. We go out and we come back. We ebb and we flow all of the time. And so we're back at this point of confluence and convergence this morning. Everything that happened to Piscataway people, the genocide, the missionization, the assimilation, the reservations, the relocations, the removals, the silences, the declassifications, the terminations from being tribal to being what we call racialized into being free people of color, we sorts submerged and quieted. It all happened before 1720. So for those of us who have been keeping up with what's going on for tribal sovereignty, what's happened to our relatives up at Mashpee, who were also among the first to be hit with this wave from across the ocean, where there's worries about de facto termination, as we speak about, which means to be detribalized or to have native sovereignties pulled apart. We're going to survive all of that. We hope it won't happen. But that's what the realities of what we've been living with for a very, very long time. So we're here to uplift each other, to see what Gregg is bringing forward to us, helping us see what's there, helping us feel it, because if you feel it, you'll remember it. So when you walk back out of this room, greet the rain and greet the rivers. Be rooted in who you are. Try to feel the soles of your feet back down to the earth itself. Go say hello to the clouds. And then make a determination of how you're going to move forward and how we move forward together. And vote tomorrow, too. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you. And we remember each other and that we're all connected like the rivers as we move forward in time. All my relations.
Sio Nagala, Victoria O'Keeffe, Dagwado'a, Chichelagi. Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria O'Keeffe. I'm an assistant professor here at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in the Department of International Health, Social and Behavioral Interventions program. I'm a member of the Cherokee and Seminole Nations of Oklahoma, and I have the great pleasure of introducing Mr. Marc Herrera, who will be providing our honor song today. Mr. Herrera is a member of the Seminole Tribe of Florida. He is from the Panther Clan. He's a senior at Howard University studying political science. And he has the amazing and inspirational goal of becoming the first Native American Supreme Court Justice. So remember his name, yeah. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Marc Herrera.
Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Come on, it's Native American Heritage Month. Louder, yeah. That's what I like to hear. So this is a prayer song. So it's in the Lakota language, and it essentially means like when we're singing, we're sending our prayers up to the Creator. This song was created by John Around Him Sr. And, he's no longer here with us, but he has left a legacy of song and spirituality behind. So he's always here, at least with me. You may not know him, but you will know him because of this song. So if you have the ability to do so, please stand up when I sing this song. Oh yeah, ma kia yo yo chema kia yo yo oh yeah ma kia yo yo chema kia yo yo hai Yani bichteloy ay ay oye ma ke ay ay che ma ke ay ay oye ma ke ay ay che ma ke ay ay hay dagu eheku hiye chek duchteloy oye ma ke ay ay yani bichteloy hay ay oye ma ke ay ay che ma ke ay ay oye ma ke ay ay che ma ke ay ay hay ay dagu eheku hiye chek duchteloy oye ma ke ay ay yani bichteloy ay ay oye ma ke ay ay che ma ke ay ay oye ma ke ay ay che ma ke ay ay dagu eheku hiye chek duchteloy oye ma ke ay ay yani bichteloy ay ay. Thank you. You may be seated.
Good afternoon and very, very warm welcome from Johns Hopkins Center for American Indian Health. I'm Allison Barlow and I have the humbling honor to direct the center. Today we are so grateful to link arms with the Native Circle faculty, student, staff advocacy group. If you're part of Native Circle, could I ask you to stand? This is the Native Circle group, thank you. Great. This is a group of advocates within the university who are working to raise awareness for Indigenous peoples, not just in the month of November, but every day. And that's why we're here today, because it's so urgent that we think about Indigenous peoples every day, every day. I also want to express my extreme gratitude to Carrie Lessard, who directs Native Lifelines. Native Lifelines is a very important urban health center for Native peoples in Baltimore and the surrounding areas within Maryland. And a lot is at stake, as we know. We all need to reach out to Native Lifelines and help them in every capacity that we have. They're very important for this area. Our center was founded in 1991 based on over 10 years of work by Johns Hopkins folks with the White Mountain Apache Tribe in Arizona. Over the course of time, that work has spread to over 120 tribal communities across the United States. And we are so humbled by what we learn about public health with Native peoples. I think Native American understanding of the importance of maintaining balance and harmony among all living things in order to ensure the health of our planet and our universe as both the scientific and spiritual core of public health. These values are more important than ever to uphold every day to heal our planet and the painful divisions that threaten our diversity. Not just in November, but all year, every year, we must strive to renew the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples and promote greater awareness about the histories and the sovereignty. I'm so pleased now to welcome Carrie Lessard, who's from the Shawnee tribal community, the Executive Director of Native American Lifelines. She's a medical anthropologist, and her work has examined the influence of historical trauma on contemporary Native communities and applies these findings to create culturally centered programs aimed at improving health outcomes. Carrie's a graduate of University of Maryland College Park, a lifelong resident of Baltimore, and she's so passionate about her work. Carrie, thank you so much for helping us make this event possible.
Carrie Lessard Nitisito Shoanwanila. My name is Carrie Lessard. I am Shawnee. I want to honor my ancestors, but also honor my ancestors who come from the Fort Peck, Assiniboine, and the Cheyenne River Sioux tribes. Those relations got here by way of the Carlisle Indian Boarding School, and I want to remember them now. Gabi, as you were talking about the Potomac, I have a particular reverence for the Shenandoah River. One of my ancestors lived along its bank shortly after the Civil War, right above where it joins with the Potomac, so we truly are relatives there. Native American Lifelines is a Title V urban Indian health program serving Baltimore and Boston communities. Native American people throughout the arc of history have been moved around a bit like pieces on a chessboard, and so we come to find ourselves as urban Indians, and the Indian Health Service has dedicated time and services and resources to Native people living in these areas. So we are pleased to serve our Native people who are living in urban settings and far away from home. We do recognize the impact that historical trauma has made in our communities, and so make every effort to remediate that through not only what we do, but how we do it. And it's sort of in this line of thinking that I came to know Gregg Deal, and it's really my pleasure to introduce him. Gregg is a very dear friend of mine, and actually we became friends through a series of heated arguments about the mascot debate and historical trauma and microaggressions and things like that. So again, it's truly my honor to introduce him today. Gregg Deal is a member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. He is the husband to the wildly witty Megan, and he is father to my 5 nieces and nephews, whom I love very much, and was a longtime resident of the DC area, but is now living just an hour outside of Denver in Colorado. Gregg is a professional artist. He's an Indigenous activist, and he's also an avid cyclist, I'll mention. What I love about Gregg's work is it is very informed by all of the amazing things that he reads, informed by anthropology, by public health, by sociology, by history. And so he brings all of that understanding to bear in the way that he interrogates stereotype, in the way that the image of Native people has been used and misused, most often almost exclusively these days, not by us, to inform others about who we are. Gregg is reclaiming that voice for Native people, and I know that you're going to really enjoy the words that he has for you today. So without taking up any more time, I would like to introduce to you my friend, Gregg Deal.
Oh, man. My voice is not usually this sexy, so I apologize. I have to take some hauls. Hamu, nu Gregg Deal, mina ni nu kiui tikara. My name is Gregg Deal. I am from Pyramid Lake. I also want to recognize the Piscataway and the land that was originally where we are standing here. I'm appreciative for the sacrifices knowingly and unknowingly given by the Piscataway people so that we may be here standing in this space. And I have to tell you guys, things go full circle. I talk to Carrie a lot. She's a relative, so we're talking all the time. But about 12 or 13 years ago, Dr. Tyack and I met at the National Museum of American Indians. It was my first job out of college, and it was really difficult. And that year that it opened, in September 2004, by April 2005, 1 million people had been through those doors, and I was part of a visitor services group. It was an all-native staff that was there to visit the people that were coming in. And nothing was a more stark reminder to the ineptitude of understanding of our existence than Americans walking through that door. And we would hear oftentimes in a week what a Native person might hear in a lifetime on a racial spectrum. And that experience came to inform a lot of different things for me, which I will share. But I do want to acknowledge how full circle that is, that we come into contact with people that, we kind of attribute our beginnings with, and how kind of incredible that is. So we're talking about art and activism, but before I really get into that, I have a tradition of introducing my center, the thing that informs everything I do, which is my family. So my wife and I have been married for 19 and a half years now. And we lived in Northern Virginia for 17 of those years. And that's me like 50 pounds ago. And she's pretty elusive on photographs. I think that's the most current one that I have. We have 5 kids. And they are both magnificent and horrifying. Having 5 kids is like having 1 million kids. There's not much difference between all those. So in order of their ages, this is Sage, she's 12, Phoenix, who's 9, Maddox, who's 6, Grayson, who's 4, and Holland, who's 2, and pretty much runs our house right now. But family is really important, and it's important to Native people as well. And family is one of these things that we're reclaiming, because we're looking now at the first generation of young people that are being born outside of the boarding school. And the boarding school is not informing our existence. And up to that point, boarding schools have damaged families and have taken away our understanding of family, because the prime years children have in understanding how parents work and how siblings work is the prime years of boarding school. And so when you take a child out of that situation, you're taking away from them family. And so we have generations of people that grew up not knowing how to be a mom and how to be a dad, and we're fixing that, because we're now looking at the first generation of young people that are not going to be affected by boarding schools. And that's just to put in perspective how this works. And so for me, it's very much about this situation of being a dad, which I love. And this is actually Sage. She was just a few years old, and she was a little gun shy on her costume, and so I told her I'd help her out and go all in. This is Sage now. And Halloween's a big thing in our house. So one year we took my oldest son and dressed him up like a white federal worker, and gave him some male pattern baldness, and I spent weeks on this, in that he would interact with people. I told him he had to act exhausted and tired all the time. And so people would be like, "What are you for Halloween?" And he'd be like, "Middle-aged." And that was it. So, and the last thing I want to share is Grayson, my 4-year-old. All of my kids, their middle names are in the language of our people, and Grayson's middle name is Nakai, which is red-tailed hawk, and the red-tailed hawk carries our prayers to the Creator. He's a special little guy. But for the last several years, my wife has been taking these pictures of him and posting them on Instagram. And she quickly began to realize that he has this very specific way in which he leans. And she has a specific name for it. She calls it the sideways pose. I think it shows that he's a professional leaner. All right, so you guys ready? So he's been doing this his whole life. And it's like not a one-off. He's been doing this since he was a baby. And that's Grayson. This is my family. This is my center. This is everything that defines who I am and even informs the work that I do. There are certain things that I've had an opportunity to see and understand because of processes that I had to go through with my kids and realizing Indigenous existence as you're growing up and as you're coming up. So I'm going to show you guys a couple of visual works just so you have a frame of reference to some things. And then I want to share with you some performance art. And I'm going to tell you guys some stories that sort of coincide with those bits of performance pieces, all of which points to the crux of my work, which is very much about Indigenous identity, historical consideration, and sort of the critical thinking that goes into those things, and the way that history can inform the work that we do in every aspect of our lives and in our jobs. I was saying this morning that we as a people are one of the few people that have to be well informed on our own existence. We're oftentimes the only Indian in the room, and therefore the most authoritative Indian in the room, and everybody expects us to have an answer for everything. And as a result, we tend to be very well informed about our history and about policies and about everything that's happening. And so that carries over very much into a lot of my work. And the reason why I think history is so incredibly important is because history has, as far as I can tell in this country, there's two ways in which history works. History works in establishing authority and establishing greatness. We are taught in schools that, we learn about Columbus, but we don't learn about the people that he came into contact with. We know about the Thanksgiving story, but we don't know what happened 2 days after the Thanksgiving story. We know who Sitting Bull is because that was at the crux of Manifest Destiny, but we don't really know what happened after that, nor do we really know all of the myriad of different tribes and leaders and people that were involved at that same exact time, nor do we know what happens after the Plains Indian Wars as people are progressing west and going into California, especially for the gold rush. And so history is taught to elevate forefathers. History is taught to establish the greatness of this country and, I think, by extension, the greatness of colonialism. Native people use history as a means to exercise and get to the root of truth. And that is there specifically to validate not just our existence, but the wrongs that have happened during that existence, which undermines greatness. And so this critical thought, this critical theory is so incredibly important in the way that it informs our current existence. And for me, it informs very much my own work. So let's look at some paintings real quick. I'm just going to go through them really fast so that you can see. This is called the new normal because now when we protest, as was the case in Standing Rock, we have to cover our faces because authorities will figure out who we are after the fact. And so now in order to protest, which we should be able to do freely in this country, we have to protect ourselves so that we don't get pinched after the fact. I mean, food sovereignty is a thing, you know, and having access to good health is definitely a thing. And identity and the way identity works. A lot of these things point to the fact that Americans in general are informed by one thing and one thing only, and that is an image that we have not given any input for. That an Indian is these things and an Indian could never be this thing. The mixing of pop culture, right? I mean, I can go and do ceremony and I can go to powwow and I can listen to Kendrick Lamar and, you know, David Bowie and whatever. My identity is way farther than having feathers on my head. And there's nothing wrong with that, but the duality of our existence is a very complicated matter for non-Native people. So I do paintings, I do murals. This was in DC for a time a few years ago. And the odd thing is nobody touched it for like 2 years. I find murals to be important because, like in this case, this is in Minneapolis, and it's on the side of the Indian Center on South Side Minneapolis. And this is about representation. This person is a member of the community there, and she and her friends get to see her, and how incredibly important it is to see ourselves in these spaces and to see ourselves represented in these spaces. It's also huge. It's like 3,800 square feet. So this doesn't really give it any justice. It's massive, like the mural is. And of course, this is in Baltimore. This is called The Duality of Indigeneity. And these two people are facing each other. One looks decidedly indigenous and one looks like a kid, but they have the same face. So it begs the question, which one's more Indian? The answer is that they're both Native. So I lived in DC for about 17 years. I went to school at George Mason University. We lived in the neighborhood my wife grew up in, and after school, I worked at the National Museum of American Indians for about a year. I got a residency, or a mentorship with James Luna, the late performance artist, Luceño performance artist, who was in Italy, and I went to Italy with him, and you know, with going to school for art and then being able to do that, like I quit the museum. I came home and I quit, and I started working freelance design work for several years. But like once the recession hit, everything went to crap, and so I started making art to kind of try to keep bringing money into the house while trying to figure out like what to do next. And what happened is the fine art work that I was doing, like this is a job, this is art, it went like this for me. And so the recession actually forced me to be resourceful, forced me to be, to hustle a little bit more and to make things happen. In the middle of that, we had, you know, my wife and I, we had some lean years. The recession hit really hard in the DC area and in the creative fields. That's the first place that they pull back from. And so I was doing shows and just kind of making things, but in 2013, I had this idea. And the idea was to essentially wear a full Native outfit that was contrived. That have a headdress that's like made in China and like have like all these elements that are all fake. Like I did a full chest piece, you know, the breastplate, but it's made out of like plastic. And not wearing moccasins, I'm wearing Vans that I painted up to look like moccasins. And I take it out into public and I document the way that people interact with me, and I document it through photography and through video. And Americans don't have enough of a context to understand how any of this works. So they just see a headdress and they're like, look, it's an Indian, right? And so I am essentially embodying the stereotype and documenting the way that people interact with me. And I called it The Last American Indian on Earth, which is completely tongue-in-cheek. But it's this idea that people believe we don't exist. And so it looks a little bit like this, which is both funny and disturbing and interesting and difficult to look at, particularly with our reference to things like appropriation and trying to understand like how appropriation or cultural appropriation works. But I want to stress the fact that when I did this, I didn't ask permission to do it. I decided that I was going to do it. I owned the fact that I was going to do it and sort of the voice that went into it, and then I went and I did it. And pretty much everybody who's a professional is just taking the knowledge that they have and they're going out there and they're executing it. And they put their chest out and they square up their shoulders and they do it with authority. Anybody could do that. And so I point that out because oftentimes we have institutions that tell us whether or not we have permission to do something. In my case, it would be like a gallery saying, okay, I will pay you this much money to put this together, or a museum doing the same thing. In this point in time, like coming like out of the middle of the recession, I created something because I didn't have anything else. And because I wanted to create something and I didn't want to sit around and wait for an institution to tell me it was okay for me to do this. And not only that, but it ends up kind of being an interesting social experiment. None of these photographs are contrived. These things happened. This family came up, wanted to take a picture with me. The guy wanted to point to his Cleveland Indians hat. And it became a really interesting litmus for the way that Americans interact with Indigenous people, or not really Indigenous people, but what they perceive to be Indigenous. And this is how far removed they are from understanding like what's real and what isn't. Because I come into contact with a Native person and they're like, so what's up with your headdress? Because they know that these are not things that you wear out in public willy-nilly. This is turkey feathers. The band on the head is, created by what I assume is probably indigenous hands in China, doing beadwork and creating all of these things that that people are familiar with in general terms and not specific terms, because nobody really has specific concepts of our identity. I always like to point out these guys are standing on Segways and I'm still taller than them. There's no authority standing on a Segway. So I took this to New York City. You can see nobody cares there. But DC is really interesting because DC is informed by a mascot and a racial slur title of that mascot, of that team. And nowhere was more volatile than when I was in Washington, DC. But then there's also the oddity of things like the Smithsonian, where things are museumized. So you can take myself, Indigenous people are museumized, and you can take a museumized thing who's taking a modern piece of technology, taking a picture of himself, a selfie as they call, in front of a museumized buffalo that's behind glass and stuffed, that is out of my reach. And the irony of a photograph like this creates a narrative that can explain a whole lot of problems that we have with our existence in terms of American culture and the American understanding of our existence. I feel like this is like a Wes Anderson film. Like there's a weird Scandinavian-looking dude off to the side. He's like in the picture. But this is also about pushing buttons and making social commentary. Because there's certain things that we know as Indigenous people exist in popular culture, and that most people know exist on some level but don't understand why or how they exist. So to talk about spirit animals is a decidedly Indigenous stereotype. But there's no frame of reference as to what it is, how it is, where it comes from, and why it's a problem. And so at this point in time, this is in 2013, and the term white guilt obviously has a much different meaning and vitriol behind it in terms of talking about white nationalism and everything else. There's a completely different conversation on the table right now than there was in 2013. But it's still a term that was a little bit difficult, a little bit scary. And in taking something like my spirit animal and I'm adding white guilt to it, I'm making fun of it, adding a little bit of context to it, a little bit of sarcasm and hurting some feelings while doing it. But this was about disruption. This was about creating problems and creating situations where people had to ask questions. I have about a 20-minute film about this. It's on my website, you can find it. And there's some pretty interesting interactions on that are all real and problematic and funny and cringeworthy. But the entire process for me was a learning experience, because you're not just creating something and trying to think critically through those things, but you're also putting yourself out there in a way that is kind of terrifying, like walking out into public and not in a safe space like a gallery or a museum or even a college. I think I might be hard pressed to do something like this ever again, because it's pretty hairy. And right after that, I did a piece called Redskin. I just have one photograph from this, but the entire point of Redskin was taking the language that exists within the discussion of mascots and the microaggressions that exist within that, and putting them in one place on one person at one time. And of course, I'm that subject, and I have 4 antagonizers, all of whom were friends of mine and willing participants that were speaking to me in the language of microaggressions. When you put those things in one place, they don't look so micro anymore. And honestly, the idea of microaggressions is interesting, because it's mostly a statement about the perception of what's being said to me, and not really the perception of what I feel when somebody says something to me. It's supposed to be the pinprick, and the pinprick of comments that come at us. So we did this piece. Carrie was a part of that and helped me a ton in trying to establish how this was going to be done and what happened. It was in DC in, I want to say 2014, I think. So, roughly 4 years ago. And after that, I did, in Denver, when I had moved to Colorado, I did a piece called Ethnographic Zoo. And ethnographic zoos, for those of you that are not familiar, were something that Western culture introduced as they were going through colonization, and they would take people who were considered other, people that were not part of Western culture, tribal people, and they would put them on display in their institutions, their power structures of museums and things. And they would put them on display in a way of objectifying them, of othering them, of, hey, come look at the savage, which was incredibly interesting, but also incredibly hurtful in informing Western culture at large about the existence of people that don't look like white Europeans. And Vine Deloria talks about ethnographic zoos for Indigenous people in the book, Custer Died for Your Sins. And he talks about these ethnographic zoos for Indigenous people still being in play. They exist in film, in literature, and paintings, and photographs, and they still encourage the Western gaze of our existence and of the othering of our existence. So I have put myself on display in front of the Denver Art Museum in downtown Denver. And after that, I did a piece called Indian Pedigree. And Indian Pedigree was about blood quantum. That's all that it's about. It's about the process of blood quantum. And I'm not going to get too much into it. If you don't know what blood quantum is, Google it. It's fascinating. But it is about the quantifying efforts of who is and who isn't Indian. And so Native people have to adhere to this, particularly tribes that are federally recognized, have to adhere to this process of fractions, deciding who is and who isn't Indian. And anybody who's enrolled in their tribe that is federally recognized knows the fractions that make up their bloodlines, because you have to. And tribes use this as part of their enrollment process. So, Some tribes, you have to be a quarter of that tribe in order to belong to that tribe. In my case, I am 15/32 Native, which is an insane fraction, but is still sound. I am 1/8 Pyramid Lake Paiute. I am 1/8 Fort Bidwell Paiute. I'm 1/8 Western Shoshone, Timuok Western Shoshone, and I'm 3/32 Washoe. And that makes up my bloodline. That's on official record. I have a federal ID number in addition to my Social Security number that comes from the federal government as well. And I had this idea that I could create a performance piece in which I had all of those fractions and all of those numbers tattooed onto my forearm permanently while I did a spoken word piece about what we call paper genocide. It is a series of processes that are meant to eliminate us because you can only belong to one tribe. So on the Bureau of Indian Affairs rolls, I'm only considered to be 1/8 Paiute, and that's it, even though I have all these other bloodlines that are involved. And the only thing that is regulated in the United States by pedigree are dogs and horses and Indians. And so I went through this process of having this tattooed on my arm. And the extension of the performance piece was to actually have something that I carried with me permanently everywhere. But it is a mark that is meant to illustrate that these are numbers and ideas and concepts that are wholly Western and that follow us everywhere we go, no matter where we are. After that, I did a piece with the Smithsonian in 2016. And the story of how this piece came together might be more interesting than the actual piece itself. But it's called the Indian Voice Removal Act of 1879 to 2016. 1879 was when the first boarding school started. That's when the Carlisle Indian School started. And what happened was the Smithsonian, well, one of the entities in the Smithsonian received the largest grant the Ford Foundation's ever awarded. And they wanted them to put on a group show, a multicultural group show. It was called Cross Lines, a culture lab on intersectionality. And it was about 40 plus artists that were in the art and industry building, which is right next to the Smithsonian Castle. And it was a purely multicultural show. People from all over the world, different identities, different ideas. And what happened during this time is the curator called me and he was like, hey, if you could do anything and there wasn't a budget issue, like what would you do? I'm like, well, that's a good question. One that's not often asked of artists, and because budget's always an issue. But I had this concept, this idea, which was about modern indigenous existence and modern indigenous living. And I wanted to build a teepee and I wanted to fill it with IKEA furniture. And there was a performative aspect of it as well. And it was really interesting. But what ended up happening, this multicultural group show, which the Smithsonian's never done, became of grave concern to the upper echelon of the Smithsonian. And so the Office of Public Affairs, the provost office, had called this curator in and said, I want you to present all of the artists participating, their work, and what they propose to do, which the poor guy did. And he had a problem with two artists. He had a problem with a Muslim performance artist, my good friend Anita Ali, who does this incredible performance piece where she wears a full covering, and her covering is red with red sequins, and it has a train. So it's very, it's not a Muslim covering. It's sort of a caricature of that as part of her performance piece, and it's called the Red Shador, and it's amazing. It's been all over the world. And the presence that she kind of arrives with is amazing. But this was in 2016. And if you remember, there was a conversation happening during the presidential candidate debates and everything about Muslims, and this was a very volatile issue. And so they arrived at this place where they said, the only way you can participate is if you don't speak. The Smithsonian Institution in 2016 put in her contract that she's not allowed to address the public in her performance piece, or she would be in breach of contract. The other artist they had an issue with was me. I don't know why. I know he showed, the curator showed them one of the images from the last American Indian on Earth, and he said there was an audible gasp in the room. I don't know why. All I can think is like well-meaning white liberal men that know what appropriation is but don't understand like the ins and outs of it. That's the only thing I can think of. And so I ended up having to adjust everything. What ended up happening was they were concerned about the content. They were concerned about the performance piece. They were like, you know, we don't know how this is going to go. What are you going to say to people? We're really concerned about that. And so I said that I would bring in a cultural interpreter, and that cultural interpreter, you know, they're like, well, what is that? I'm like, well, it's a white gentleman that will be with me at all times and will explain to people what I'm doing and what I'm saying. And they said, okay, that's great. Like, that's perfect. And so I ended up redoing my entire setup. And instead, we still had the teepee. I had a cultural interpreter. I filled the space with paintings of that were taken from old Ed Curtis photographs, because it's basically old men in headdress. And so it's familiar. That's a familiar narrative. And they said, okay, and we did it. And so I had my friend, and we turned it into a performance piece in that, like, people would come in and they would talk to me and they would ask me questions, and I would give a very thoughtful answer to Jeremy, my partner in crime in this. That's him. And he would in turn tell them what I just said, but he would always get it wrong. So it was this process, and it was meant to mirror my experience with the Smithsonian, because I would say, I'm going to do this, and then it would go through this cycle, and they'd be like, we should adjust that because your narrative is not familiar to us. Because there's value that is given to the stories that are familiar. There's no value given to the stories that are not. And so I played off of that and turned it into this whole other thing. And then in the midst of that, because this is, if you remember the title, a culture lab on intersectionality, which is to say that each of the groups and each of the ethnic groups and sexual identities, and they're talking about things that all intersect, things that are familiar, things that make sense, ways in which we're able to relate to each other in our existence on this earth. And Anita and I became very good friends because we were both going through this censorship, culture checking, and frankly, discriminatory process. And we decided that we would intersect, and that we would create a piece together on our own that lasted all of about 5 minutes, and we would call it Existence as Protest. And it turned into what I believe was one of the most incredible things I was ever able to do in terms of looking at the way that Americans look at Muslims and looking at the way that Americans look at Native people, the recent history of Muslims and the long history of Indigenous people as we're surrounded by these flags. And we got in big trouble for doing this. I'm going to skip over Supreme Law of the Land. This was a piece about Standing Rock. And it was about Standing Rock in that Standing Rock is about treaty land. At its core, the Standing Rock issue is about treaty land, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. And so I basically read the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 while I was antagonized by 2 white gentlemen in suits pouring oil on me. Don't be afraid, it's chocolate syrup. But it looks like oil, and so that was a performance piece I did. I came up with it in December after they cleared the camp. And I figured, well, I was gonna do it in January, but I figured like, okay, everything's done, so I'll do this sort of in solidarity, in memorial of Standing Rock. The Friday I did this at the Denver Art Museum, that week, the Tuesday before that happened, was when Trump signed the executive orders for the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone Pipeline. So it ended up being incredibly timely. But this is also on my website as I videotaped it and I edited it down, and it's interesting. But I want to share my latest performance piece. It's called Invisible Lost Movement. I just did it in August, and I did it with my daughter, Sage, and it is the only thing I've ever created that's metaphorical, because everything's pretty literal, everything's pretty in your face. This was about existence. And so what I did was I took the concept of powwow dance and outfits, which is very much about color and movement, and the way in which we're informed by those things. So a non-native person can go to a powwow and they're gonna hear music, and they're gonna see the dancers, they're gonna hear the bells that the dancers have or the cones that they have on their outfits. And there's even an MC that's gonna inform everything that they're looking at. This is the dance that's coming up. And if you've ever been to a powwow, they all sound the same. It's just like, men's northern traditional, hookah, and that's it. That's a powwow. But that informs what you're looking at, and it informs what's happening. So even a non-native person who's not familiar with powwows can see these things. And we're even informed by the two little old ladies standing behind you complaining about how bad the fry bread is. So it's a sensory overload. And I had this idea of what happens if we were to strip all of that away. What if we took away the color from the outfits? What if we took away the sound of the drum and the songs that accompany the drum? What if we took away every bit of context, and that it could stand as a metaphor for existing but not existing, about being visible but also about being invisible? So I made monochromatic outfits. They're black. The outfits are as intricate as any powwow outfit. So the beadwork is black, the ribbon work is black, the leather work is black, the feathers are black, everything is black. And there's no music. We perform this. So my daughter is she's jingle dress dancing. I'm doing a northern traditional, and we're wearing wireless headphones so we can hear the beat, we can follow what's going on, we can hit the honor beats at the same time, but nobody who's seeing it can hear a thing except our outfits. And it looks like this. And the play on color suddenly takes these intricate outfits and it makes them look like silhouettes. It makes them look like shadows of what they actually are. And it's meant to be a metaphor for what you're looking at, the metaphor of existence, and not literal. And it was really difficult because we did this in front of about 150 people or so. And the questions afterwards were really telling about how we're viewed as Native people. What does the dance mean? What do the bells mean? Why do you have beadwork here? Why do you have feathers here? Instead of looking at this as a viable art piece and looking at the very specific aesthetic of a viable piece of art and why these things work the way they work. As a Native person, I am informed by my indigeneity. And so as a contemporary artist, I can also be informed by that indigeneity, and it can inform the work that I create. In Western culture, in America, we are being dictated by the perception of people outside of our community. And those people are deciding what is Indian and what is not Indian, what has value and what doesn't have value. I'm interested in knowing what contemporary Indigenous art looks like when it is not informed by a Western buyer's market, but instead is informed by our stories, the ones that are familiar and the ones that are not familiar. Because that is about taking back the narratives that are ours. That is about asserting the authority we have over our own identity, which is about mental health, which is about spiritual health, which is about having safe spaces and a proper outlook on yourself, your self-esteem, your self-worth, all of which contribute to depression and suicide and everything that is happening within our communities that are taking our young people and, frankly, our older people away from us. And I am interested in knowing what these things look like and how these things represent us in a way that is going to help our younger generations. I'm confident that my children have a pretty good view of themselves in this world that is both realistic, but also, I think, hopeful too. Because you can still be phenomenally Indigenous, and you can still create contemporary art, and you can still also be a willing participant of this human landscape that we're currently in. I create art because it's my medicine. I make art because it's who I am, and it is essentially all that I have. This is my life's work. And the exploration that I have in my life's work, I get a lot of liberal ways in which I get to do that. A lot of other jobs don't have that. However, the way that we understand ourselves and the way we walk on this land, the way we walk on this earth, the way that we interact with other people, the way that we think critically about all of these things in the spaces that we exist in, whether you're in a medical profession or you're in an academic profession or you're an artist or you're a musician or you're a poet or you work construction or you work at 7-Eleven or you work at McDonald's, it doesn't matter, because our existence is still informed by the spaces that we live in. Are there spaces being made that are for our inclusion? Are we having an opportunity to represent ourselves in the best way possible? Because I can tell you, Indigenous people are more concerned about what happens on these lands than any other people on these lands. We have a stake in what's happening here. That's why Standing Rock happened. That's why Bears Ears is happening. That's why we talk about mascots, because that is very much about perception and self-perception. I'm not offended by the Washington Redskins. It doesn't mean it's not offensive. And I'm also concerned about the health and well-being of my children and their perception of themselves. We already know that mascots play a role in diminishing young people's view of themselves, while simultaneously taking white children and elevating themselves in the same moment. And if, as a father, I'm not concerned about the health and well-being of my children when it comes to something like mascots, well, then what the hell am I doing? These things are all connected. Our place in this world, the inclusion of our place in this world, the way in which we are represented, the way that the rest of the world sees us, ultimately is the way that we see ourselves. And I'm grateful that we are in a place where we're beginning to take these things back. We're beginning to assert that power. But we have a long way to go. We have a really long way to go. We need to assert ourselves, and we need allies to facilitate us asserting ourselves. And that is the way that we make change, and that is the way that we change the narrative that exists. Because the story of boarding schools is just as important as the Plains Indian Wars. The story of forced sterilization for women in the 60s and 70s through IHS is as important as the fight for mascots. Those are part of American history. Recent and not recent. And American history, like I said before, is meant to illustrate greatness, but I believe that history can be used to find truth and to create spaces that are more reflective of our view of the world. It's okay to take statues down if those statues no longer represent our values and our morals. It's okay to adjust those narratives and talk about the Taino people and not just Columbus. To talk about the Emancipation Proclamation and the largest mass hanging in United States history in the same space that were both perpetuated by Abraham Lincoln. This is history. These are the things that validate us. These are the things that will bring our truths to the forefront. These are the things that will create equality, and these are the things that are going to allow us to assert the authority that we have over our identity. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Awesome.
So I think those of you who picked up a program coming in, this is being live streamed, so we wanted to be sure that people who were not here physically could also ask questions. So Anne's going to step in here, but if you launch your web browser to www.pigeonhole.at, And then the password is Gregg with 2 G's, Deal. Okay, and so I think, Greg, questions will come up on the screen, I hope.
Oh, really?
But in the meantime, if someone has a question, stand up and ask it.
So if you were on your way here and you do not have your keys, security turned in the keys to me at the electronics table, so they're up front. I'll take them to the table over here.
Questions? Oh, what should I say to my family members who like, I feel like that's a personal question. You know, I'm actually, I'm a fan of the conversation. I'm also a fan of diplomacy. Something that I learned, and the reason for this is because I believe, particularly Americans, are beholden to what they know. And so if you're never taught about like the meaning of the Washington football team, if you're never taught about Thanksgiving and the story that's there, there's a chance that a lot of people come by that information honestly. That's not to omit responsibility, but it is to say that people coming to the table may be limited in their understanding. And I think it's important to speak in a language that people understand. And so, like I said, I do actually think this is a personal question. But if I were to give advice, I would, you know, I mean, unless you're all about family drama, and that's okay too. I honestly, I would ease into the conversation. Change can happen overnight, but I think some of the most meaningful change happens over time, because you begin to come to an understanding of things over time. So there's people who, you know, 10 years ago were like, you know, the Redskins issue is stupid, it doesn't mean anything. And now after several protests, talking points on every major news channel, and a Comedy Central segment, like we're in a different place because we've been able to have conversations with different mediums, with different vernaculars, and being able to develop that vernacular so that we are all on the same page with the language that we're speaking. So I would suggest that, but you know, drama's okay too. So that's the best answer I can give to that, I think. How do I engage with and learn about a culture that isn't mine, but I want to learn more about without objectifying it? That's a tough question, particularly with Native people, because a lot of things do go to a place of objectification. But I think that if you are deliberately and knowingly taking steps forward, you can deliberately and knowingly ask questions about what you're looking at too. Because if it starts to go into a place of romanticism, if it starts to go into a place of objectifying what you're looking at, you have the capability to discern what's happening and to make decisions based on that. Because you can find truth in places that are not terribly respectful towards like Indigenous people, but you can still pull truth out of that, and you can decide to take that truth and apply it appropriately and try to find something better. So I think that learning is a process. Knowing, like, for example, if you look at the Sand Creek Massacre. So Sand Creek Massacre kind of happened at the beginning of Plains Indian Wars, and then Wounded Knee happened sort of at the end. So the Manifest Destiny and the Plains Indian Wars are bookended by these two incredibly horrible massacres. But if you go on Wikipedia and you read about the Sand Creek Massacre, there's a lot of good information there. There's not all the information. It doesn't give a complete like layout of all that information, but it's a good place to start, and you can find things in there that can take you to the next place. So I think you just have to look and think critically about what you're looking at. And it's okay to ask questions. If you have a Native friend, it's okay to ask questions. We're okay with you asking questions. And I don't think that there's anything disrespectful about asking questions. I think disrespect is inflected. So just ask nicely. talk about how identity is related to health and whether a person is aware of that relationship or not. So I'm not a doctor, but I am familiar with intergenerational and historical trauma and the way that those things inform our self-view and our own sense of self-respect. And identity is a really important process because Native people are also trying to navigate through this sort of post-colonial view of what we are. 200 years ago, somebody who's not Native decided that an Indian is an old man in buckskin and a headdress. There's 577 tribes in the United States, and of those, there's about a dozen that wear headdresses. And so headdress is quintessentially not, the identifying factor of Indians, particularly when you look on a gender spectrum. I mean, not all Indians are old men in headdresses. And in most cases, the most prominent members of tribal communities are the women. And so being aware of that relationship, I think, has a lot to do with being informed with where you're at and where that identity is, asserting that identity. There's a lot of papers written about it. There's a lot of books that are out about it right now. So there are a lot of people are talking about it, and the language is definitely there. And I think that identity is absolutely related to health in that we all are trying to figure out a place to fit in. I mean, when I was a kid, I didn't go to school with anybody that looked like me. I went to an all-white school. The only things I saw that were close to something like me was like Looney Tunes cartoons, and which were like these gross caricatures and mascots, and then later in the 90s, like Dances with Wolves and Last of the Mohicans. But those movies are not about Indians. Those are about white men that are suffering in behalf of Indians, and the Indians are the backdrop. So it immediately is giving, it is assigning importance to the roles of natives. We're like the D-list actors of our own storylines. And so your worth, I mean, whether you like it or not, if history is telling you that you're less important than Christopher Columbus, or that you're less important than General George Armstrong Custer, then you begin to come to a place of realizing inadvertently that you are not important, that your identity is not important, that your opinion is not important, that asserting authority within those things are not important, and all of that points to an already dire situation of mental health problems that lead to suicide, self-mutilation, and abuse, and so on and so forth. So I think that's where all of that connects. Oh. That's a lot of questions. Whoa. What percentage of Indigenous people vote? You should mention 4 directions, efforts to register people. I don't know a lot about that. Does anybody know anything about that, really? I know that in some states, like North Dakota is very segregated, and so voting is kind of a commodity in a place like that. But the last set of votes put a Democratic senator into place there. So what's happening right now is some significant voter suppression to keep that Native vote out there. But what that ultimately means is that in states like Arizona and California and Montana and North Dakota and South Dakota and even Idaho and Washington and Colorado and Utah and New Mexico, these are all states that have high Indian populations, and Indians can be a swing vote, but they just have to get out there and they have to vote. And the same thing is happening in Georgia, where the black vote is coming out, and they're changing everything that's happening right now. It's amazing. I don't know what those percentages are, and I don't know about 4 directions, but I suppose anybody that's watching, you should Google that and check it out. How do you navigate between the limitations of institutions and funding opportunities that are needed to make money and the inherent discomfort of activism? Gosh, that's a really complicated question. I mean, I can tell you how I do. I move forward no matter what. I am not of the opinion that any institution will either validate me or invalidate me. That I will move forward regardless if the money is there or not, and that if I am to receive blessings from the Creator that would allow me to do the things that I need to do, that it's going to happen regardless of whoever is there. Like, something will come up. Funding opportunities. I mean, I think it's just like anything in business. It's about building relationships, and it's about networking and making connections, finding those people that understand that you as a Native person, or me like as an artist, that there's value in my work, and that there's something worth investing in and putting forward. So yeah, I think you just have to move forward.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. We're so grateful to you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
We learned so much. So there are dozens of questions behind this, and I think we all will continue to percolate on them. But we want to thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
I know that we're all taking a lot with us, and thank you too for helping us remember what we should take out of this room and keep with us in the confluence of peoples and ideas and the responsibility that we have to Indigenous peoples every day. So please take that with you. To help us end in a good way, Marc Herrera is going to sing a closing song, which is in effect a closing blessing. And after that, you're free to talk among all the guests who are here. And thank you again for being here.
Hey, Marc, before you get, can I recognize, we have a student from Howard University who belongs to the Seminole Nation who's singing a Lakota song. Yeah. And I think that speaks to the intertribal nature, the sharing of culture and identities across tribal nations. I think that's amazing. I was sitting there thinking about that while you were singing, how incredible that is. So I'm grateful that you're here. Thank you.
Appreciate the words. So, I'm from the Seminole Tribe of Florida, but, you know, coming out to DC, meeting different natives, you start to like pick up on other people's cultures, and that's not necessarily like appropriating their culture, because they sort of adopt you into their space as long as you respect them, right? So I started singing at a lodge, started learning about Sweat Lodge culture, and I started learning the Lakota language, and it's been a journey ever since. I got to sing at a Sundance during the summer, so it's been a beautiful blessing to come here and sing for you guys, and just make sure you're blessed throughout your entire week. Thank you, Gregg, for coming and speaking on behalf of, you know, I don't like to say it, but on behalf of all of us, because like we always have that responsibility as Native people, because we're always sometimes the only one in the room. So this song is a Wopila song. So Wopila means the act of giving thanks, you know. So I'm giving thanks for everyone being here and learning, and then we're giving thanks to each other being here. So if you can, again, please stand. Tunka shila pila maya ye, pila maya ye, pila maya ye lo aya heya, we chose aniwa, pila maya ye. Tunka shila pela maya ye, pela maya ye, pela maya ye lo aya heya, we chose aniwa, maya kucha pila maya yellow hiya hiya tunka shila pila maya ye pila maya ye pila maya yellow hiya hiya we chose ani wahu maya